The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Layla moved quietly through the living room, her cleaning cloth barely making a sound. She had learned long ago that the best maids were the invisible ones. In houses like this, you existed only when needed, and disappeared the moment your task was done. She'd been working in Rashid Al-Mansour's mansion for 8 months now. 8 months of polishing floors that already gleamed, dusting furniture that collected no dust, and pretending she didn't hear the way he spoke to his staff. To Rashid, people like her were just part of the furniture. Useful, replaceable, forgettable. Tonight was different, though. The house buzzed with energy. Rashid was hosting a gathering of his business associates, wealthy men in expensive suits who smelled of cologne that probably cost more than her monthly salary. They sat in the expansive living room, drinks in hand, laughing at jokes that Layla suspected weren't really that funny. But when you're rich, people laugh at everything you say. She kept her head down, moving along the edges of the room, trying to finish her work before the evening got too late. Her back ached from scrubbing bathroom tiles all afternoon, and her fingers were raw from wringing out mops, but complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. This job paid for the tiny room she shared with 2 other women. It put food on her table. It kept her alive. As she approached the far corner of the room, she found herself near the grand piano. It stood there like a sleeping giant, its polished black surface reflecting the chandelier's light. A Steinway. Even someone who didn't know pianos would recognize its beauty. Layla's heart tightened in her chest. She hadn't been this close to a piano in 3 years. She reached out carefully with her cloth, intending to wipe away a fingerprint from its surface. Her hand trembled slightly as it touched the smooth wood. So many memories lived in an instrument like this. So many lost dreams. Well, well, well. What do we have here? Rashid's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. Layla pulled her hand back quickly, turning to face him. He was walking toward her, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble. His guests had turned to watch, curious about what had caught their host's attention. "The maid seems interested in my piano," Rashid announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the group. "Tell me, do you play?" Layla's mouth went dry. She knew that tone. She'd heard it before from people like him. It wasn't a real question. It was the setup for a joke, and she was the punchline. I was just cleaning, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, come now. Don't be shy." Rashid gestured grandly toward the piano, playing to his audience. "A beautiful instrument like this shouldn't just sit here looking pretty. It should be played. And since you were so interested in it, why don't you give us a little performance?" The other men laughed, leaning forward in their seats. This was going to be entertaining. Watching a housemaid fumble at a piano that cost more than she'd earn in her lifetime, this was the kind of story they'd tell at their next golf game. "Sir, I really should get back to my work," Layla said, her heart pounding. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. "Nonsense." Rashid waved his hand dismissively. "I insist. Consider it part of your duties tonight. Entertain my guests. Surely you know how to press a few keys." More laughter. One of the men called out, "Maybe she can play us Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." The room erupted in amusement. Layla stood frozen. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to walk away, to maintain what little dignity she had left. But she needed this job. She needed the money. And men like Rashid didn't take no for an answer. Refusing him would mean being out on the street by morning. She looked at the piano. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd touched piano keys. 3 years since the bombs had fallen. 3 years since everything had turned to ash. "I'm waiting," Rashid said, his voice carrying an edge now. The amusement was giving way to impatience. He wasn't used to being kept waiting. Layla's legs felt like lead as she walked toward the piano bench. The room had gone quiet, all eyes fixed on her. She could feel their anticipation, their readiness to laugh. They'd already decided how this would go. The poor, uneducated maid would hammer at the keys like a child, and they'd all have a good laugh before moving on to their cigars and business deals. She sat down on the bench, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. The last time she'd sat like this was in Damascus. The concert hall had been full that night. 200 people had come to hear her play Rachmaninoff. She remembered the weight of her black dress, the way the stage lights had made the piano glow, the absolute silence before she played that first note. Then the explosions had started. The ceiling had collapsed. The screaming, the dust, the blood. Any time now, Rashid called out, taking another sip of his whiskey. We haven't got all night. Layla's hands hovered over the keys. They were cold, these keys. Not like the warm ivory she remembered. But they were still keys. And despite everything that had happened, despite all she'd lost, her fingers remembered. She closed her eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough to push away the fear, the humiliation, the 3 years of silence. When she opened them again, something had shifted. Yes, she was still a maid. Yes, these men still thought she was nothing. But before she was a maid, before she was a refugee, before she was a survivor, she had been something else. She had been a pianist. Her fingers touched the keys and the room held its breath. Rashid raised his glass to his lips, ready to laugh. His guests leaned back, smirking. None of them knew. None of them could possibly know, but they were about to find out. The first note sang out into the room, clear and perfect, and Layla began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room like water flowing into an empty vessel. Soft at first, tender, each note perfectly placed. Layla's fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that came from thousands of hours of practice, from a lifetime that felt like it belonged to someone else now. The smirk on Rashid's face began to fade. He lowered his glass slowly, the whiskey forgotten. Around the room, the laughter died in throats. The businessman who had joked about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star sat up straighter, his expression changing from amusement to confusion, then to something else entirely. Layla didn't see any of it. Her eyes were closed now, her body swaying slightly with the music. The melody grew, building in complexity. Her left hand danced across the lower keys while her right hand sang out the main theme. This wasn't someone who had taken a few lessons. This wasn't someone fumbling through a simple tune. This was mastery. In the third measure, she added a subtle rubato, a slight hesitation that made the phrase breathe. It was the kind of detail that only someone who truly understood music would think to include, the kind of touch that separated a good pianist from an exceptional one. Rashid found himself moving closer without realizing it. He'd owned this piano for 5 years. It had cost him a fortune. He'd bought it because a designer told him every luxury home needed a grand piano in the living room. In 5 years, he'd never heard it sound like this. He hadn't known it could sound like this. The music swelled, Layla's fingers flying across the keys now with breathtaking speed and precision. The ornamentations came naturally, effortlessly. Her hands crossed, separated, came together again in perfect harmony. She leaned into the emotional passages, her whole body engaged with the music. This wasn't just playing. This was pouring out something that had been locked away. One of the guests, a man named Tariq who actually knew classical music, leaned forward with his mouth slightly open. He'd attended concerts at the Vienna Opera House. He'd heard professional pianists at prestigious venues across Europe. What he was hearing now in his friend's living room from a woman in a maid's uniform was world-class. The room had transformed. Moments ago it had been full of wealthy men showing off, networking, making deals. Now it was a concert hall. Every person sat motionless, afraid that even breathing too loud might disturb the music. The chandelier's light seemed softer somehow, more appropriate for the moment. Layla's hands moved through the middle section of the nocturne, where the melody becomes more complex, more introspective. Her fingers found every note with absolute certainty. There were no mistakes, no hesitations. Just pure, beautiful music that spoke of longing and loss and somehow, despite everything, hope. Rashid felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Was it shame? He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly ashamed of himself. He thought about his words from minutes ago, the way he'd called her over to humiliate her, the way his guests had laughed, the way he'd expected her to embarrass herself for their entertainment. Who was this woman? The question hit him with unexpected force. He'd seen her cleaning his house for 8 months. 8 months of walking past her in hallways, leaving messes for her to clean up, never once looking at her as a real person, never once wondering about her story. To him, she'd been a maid, just a maid, nothing more. But people who played like this didn't come from nowhere. This level of skill required years of training, dedication, talent that you were born with and then spent your whole life refining. This was someone who had studied at prestigious institutions, someone who had performed on real stages, someone who had lived an entirely different life before ending up in his house with a mop and bucket. The nocturne moved into its final section. Layla's playing became even more tender, more vulnerable. Each note seemed to carry weight meaning. Her right hand sang out the melody one last time, and her left hand provided the gentlest accompaniment, like a heartbeat underneath a whisper. Tariq had tears in his eyes. He wasn't embarrassed by them. Music this honest, this raw, deserved tears. The final chord hung in the air. Layla held it, letting it fade naturally, her foot on the sustain pedal. The note decayed slowly, gradually, until the room was silent again. She kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, her eyes still closed. She was back in Damascus, back in the concert hall, back when she was just a pianist, not a refugee, not a maid, not a survivor. Just a woman who spoke through music because sometimes words weren't enough. Then reality came crashing back. She opened her eyes and lifted her hands from the keys. The weight of what she'd just done hit her. She'd revealed herself. She'd shown them who she really was, and that was dangerous. It was always dangerous to let people see too much. She turned on the bench, ready to apologize, ready to beg Rashid not to fire her for taking liberties with his piano. But the words caught in her throat. Everyone was staring at her. But not with mockery, not with laughter. Tariq was wiping his eyes. Another man looked stunned, like he'd just witnessed something he couldn't quite process. A third was shaking his head slowly in disbelief or admiration or both. And Rashid. Rashid stood closest to the piano, his expensive whiskey still in his hand, looking at her like he'd never seen her before. Because he hadn't. Not really. The silence stretched. It felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Tariq began to clap. Slow at first, then faster. The others joined in. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause. Real applause. Not the polite kind you give at corporate functions. The kind you give when you've witnessed something extraordinary. Layla stood up quickly, her face burning. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She'd received standing ovations before, but that was in another life. In that life, she'd worn elegant dresses and taken graceful bows. Now she wore a uniform and dirty shoes, and these men were applauding her like she'd just performed at Carnegie Hall. That was Chopin, Tariq said, his voice full of wonder. Nocturne in E-flat major. I've heard it performed by some of the best pianists in the world, and I have never heard it played with such feeling. Where did you train? Another guest asked, leaning forward. Which conservatory? But Layla couldn't answer. Her throat was tight, her eyes stinging. She'd kept this part of herself locked away for 3 years. 3 years of silence. 3 years of pretending she was no one, nothing, just hands to clean and scrub and serve. And now, in one moment of weakness or strength, she didn't know which, she'd let it all come pouring out. She looked at Rashid. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He just stood there, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. The glass in his hand was trembling slightly. I should go, Layla whispered. I should finish my work. She moved toward the door, but Rashid's voice stopped her. Wait. Just one word, but it carried weight. Authority. But something else, too. Something that might have been respect, though Layla wasn't sure Rashid knew how to speak with respect to someone like her. She stopped but didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't bear to see whatever came next. Everyone, Rashid said quietly, his voice strange, unfamiliar even to himself. I think we should call it a night. His guests protested, wanted to know more about the mysterious pianist, but Rashid was firm. Within 15 minutes, they were all gone, still talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. And then it was just Layla and Rashid alone in the vast living room, with the piano between them like a bridge between two worlds. Layla stood frozen near the doorway, her back still to Rashid. She could hear him moving behind her, the soft clink of his glass being set down on a table. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with questions that she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. You don't have to be afraid, Rashid said finally. His voice was different from before. Quieter, almost careful. I'm not going to fire you. She turned slowly, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time in 8 months. Really meeting them. He looked different somehow. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. Please. He gestured to one of the leather chairs near the window. Sit down. I'd like to talk to you. If that's all right. Layla hesitated. In 8 months of working here, she'd never sat in this room except at the piano bench moments ago. Maids didn't sit in the living room. They cleaned it and disappeared. But something in his tone made her move toward the chair. She sat on the edge of it, her posture straight, ready to leave at any moment. Rashid pulled up another chair sitting across from her. He didn't lean back like he owned the space. He sat forward, his hands clasped between his knees. For a long moment he just looked at her, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I need to apologize," he said. The words seemed difficult for him, like a language he rarely spoke. "What I did tonight was cruel. I brought you over to that piano to embarrass you in front of my friends." That was wrong. Layla didn't know what to say. She'd expected many things, but not this. Not an apology. "I've been thinking," he continued. "In the 8 months you've worked here, I don't think I've ever asked you a single question about yourself. Not one. I don't know where you're from. I don't know if you have family. I don't even know your full name." "It's Layla Haddad," she said quietly. "Layla Haddad," he repeated, like he was testing the words. "Tell me, Layla, how does someone who plays piano like that end up working as a maid?" The question hung in the air. It was the question, wasn't it? The one that contained her entire story. 3 years of pain compressed into a single sentence. She looked down at her hands, rough and red from cleaning chemicals. These hands had once been her most valuable asset. Now they scrubbed toilets. "I'm from Damascus," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Syria. I grew up there. My father was a music teacher, not wealthy, but he recognized that I had talent. He saved everything he could to send me to the Arab Institute of Music when I was 12. Rashid leaned forward, listening intently. "I studied there for 8 years. Piano performance. Classical music. I practiced 6, sometimes 8 hours a day. My teacher said I had something special. Not just technical skill, but emotional depth. The ability to make people feel something when I played." She paused, remembering. By the time I was 20, I was performing regularly. Concert halls in Damascus, Aleppo, even Beirut. Small venues at first, then bigger ones. I had a recording contract being discussed. There was talk of a tour through Europe. "What happened?" Rashid asked, though he probably already knew the answer. "War happened," Layla said simply. "In 2019, I had a performance scheduled at the National Opera House in Damascus. A big one. Important critics were coming. It was supposed to be my breakthrough moment. I'd practiced for months. I wore my mother's pearl necklace for good luck." Her voice cracked slightly. "I was halfway through Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 when the bombs started falling." Rashid's expression darkened. The ceiling came down. Not all at once, but in sections. "I remember the chandelier falling just like that one." She pointed up at the crystal fixture above them. There was screaming. So much screaming. The pianist's bench protected me from the worst of it, but all around me people were dying. The conductor, members of the orchestra, people in the audience who had just come to hear music. She stopped, her breathing unsteady. She hadn't spoken about that night in 3 years. Hadn't let herself remember it in detail. "My younger brother was in the audience that night," she continued. "He was 17. He'd insisted on coming even though he had exams the next day. He wanted to support me. We never found his body." Rashid closed his eyes briefly. "After that night, everything fell apart. Our house was destroyed in another bombing a week later. My parents fled to Turkey. I tried to stay, tried to keep performing, but the concert halls were rubble. The music school was gone. Everyone I knew was either dead or scattered across the world. Damascus became a graveyard. How did you end up here?" Rashid asked gently. "A friend had contacts in Dubai. She helped me get a visa. I arrived with nothing. No credentials that anyone here recognized. No contacts in the music world, no money. I tried to find work as a piano teacher, but without proper documentation, without references that could be verified, no one would hire me. The few times I mentioned I'd been a concert pianist, people looked at me like I was lying, like I was making it up to seem important." She laughed bitterly. "Maybe I was. Maybe that person I used to be was so far gone she might as well have been a fantasy. So I stopped talking about it. I took the first job I could find. Cleaning houses. It paid. It kept me alive. That's all that mattered." "But you never played again?" "In 3 years?" "I couldn't," Layla said, and now tears were sliding down her cheeks. "Every time I thought about playing, I saw that concert hall. I heard the screams. I saw the chandelier falling. Music had been everything to me, my whole life. And in one night it became connected to the worst thing I'd ever experienced. It hurt too much to even think about it." "Then why did you play tonight?" Layla wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Because you ordered me to. And I needed this job. But also, she paused, searching for the truth. Maybe part of me was tired of hiding. Tired of pretending I was no one. When you told me to play, expecting me to embarrass myself, something inside me broke. Or maybe it woke up. I don't know. I just knew that I couldn't sit at that piano and pretend I didn't know how to play, even if it cost me everything. Rashid stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Dubai skyline. The lights of the city stretched endlessly in every direction. He'd always loved this view. It represented everything he'd built, everything he owned. But tonight it looked different. Tonight it looked like 1,000 stories he'd never bothered to learn. 1,000,000 people with lives as complex as his own, and he'd never once stopped to consider any of them. I've been wealthy my entire life, he said, still facing the window. My father was wealthy. His father before him. I've never had to struggle for anything. Never had to lose anything I couldn't replace. And somewhere along the way I stopped seeing people as people. They became functions. The driver. The cook. The maid. Not humans with stories and dreams and pain. Just roles to fill. He turned back to face her. You could have been performing in concert halls all over the world right now. You should have been. Instead, you're scrubbing my floors because the world is cruel and random and unfair. That's just how life is, Layla said quietly. No, Rashid said firmly. That's how life has been. But it doesn't have to stay that way. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. I have a friend. Actually, Tariq, the man who was here tonight crying at your performance. He sits on the board of the Dubai Opera House. He's been complaining for months that they need fresh talent for next season. Would you be willing to audition? Layla's heart stopped. I don't have my repertoire prepared. I haven't performed in 3 years. I don't even have proper clothes for an audition. None of that matters, Rashid said. If you can play like you did tonight, they'll want you. Trust me. Why are you doing this? Layla asked, searching his face. Why do you care? Rashid was quiet for a moment. Because tonight you showed me something I'd forgotten. That every person has value. That talent and dignity don't care about your job title or bank account. You humbled me, Layla, and I don't get humbled often. He smiled slightly. Also because it's the right thing to do, and I haven't done the right thing in a very long time. Layla stood up, her legs shaky. I don't know if I can. 3 years is a long time. What if I've lost it? You haven't lost anything, Rashid said. That was clear tonight. But I understand if you're scared. Take some time to think about it. In the meantime, my piano is yours. Practice whenever you want. And Layla, you don't have to clean anymore. Consider yourself my guest until we figure this out. As Layla left the room that night, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. It was small, fragile, barely there. But it was real. It was hope. The first morning after everything changed, Layla woke up at 5:30 out of habit. Her body was trained to start work early, to finish cleaning before the household stirred. She was halfway through putting on her uniform when she remembered. She didn't need to clean anymore. Rashid had said she was a guest now. She sat back down on her bed, the uniform folded in her lap, unsure what to do with herself. Being a guest felt more uncomfortable than being a maid. At least as a maid, she knew her place, knew what was expected of her. This new arrangement left her floating in uncertainty. Around 8, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Fatima, the cook, holding a tray with breakfast. Mr. Rashid asked me to bring this to you, Fatima said, her eyes curious but kind. He said you're not to work anymore. The whole staff is talking about what happened last night. About the piano. Layla took the tray, embarrassed. I don't want special treatment. I can eat in the kitchen like always, Fatima smiled. Things change, dear. Sometimes for the better. Eat your breakfast. And later, if you want to talk, I'm here. After Fatima left, Layla picked at her food, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to eat much. What was she supposed to do all day? Where did she fit now? She thought about the piano downstairs and her heart raced. Rashid had said she could practice whenever she wanted, but the thought terrified her. Playing last night had been one thing. She'd been angry, humiliated, pushed into a corner. But choosing to play, intentionally opening that door to her past, that was different. Still by noon, she found herself standing outside the living room, listening. The house was quiet. Rashid had left for a business meeting. Most of the staff were busy in other parts of the mansion. The piano sat there, waiting. She walked to it slowly, like approaching something that might bite. She sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard, exposing the keys. They gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Beautiful, perfect, patient. She placed her hands in position, taking a deep breath. Then she began with scales. Simple C major up and down. Her fingers were stiff at first, uncertain. 3 years of cleaning had built different kinds of muscles. But gradually they began to remember. Muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. After scales, she moved to exercises. Hanon, Churney. The technical drills that had bored her as a teenager but now felt like coming home. With each passing minute, her fingers loosened, found their old pathways, rediscovered their strength. Then she played Chopin again. The same nocturne from last night, but this time for herself. No audience, no pressure, just her and the music. And this time she cried while she played. Let the tears fall onto the keys as her hands moved through the phrases. She cried for her brother, for Damascus, for the 3 years she'd spent in silence, for everything she'd lost and everything she'd been too afraid to hope for. When she finished, she heard soft clapping behind her. She turned, startled, to find Rashid standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "I didn't know you were back. Don't apologize." "That was beautiful." He walked into the room, loosening his tie. "I've been thinking about something all day. Tariq called me this morning. He's arranged an audition for you at the Opera House. Next Friday. Are you interested?" Layla's breath caught. "That's only 9 days away. Is that a yes?" She looked at the piano, then back at him. "I don't know if I'm ready. 9 days to prepare after 3 years of not playing? What if I fail? What if I've lost too much?" "You won't fail," Rashid said with certainty. "But I understand the fear. What if we did this together?" "What do you mean?" "I'll be here while you practice. Not to watch like some audience member. Just to be present. Sometimes having another person in the room makes it easier, doesn't it? Less lonely." Layla thought about it. She'd always practiced alone before, but that was when she was confident. When music was her natural language. Now everything felt fragile, new again. "You'd really do that? Just sit here while I practice?" "I have nowhere more important to be." And so that's what they did. Every afternoon for the next 9 days, Rashid would finish his morning business and come home. He'd sit in one of the leather chairs, sometimes with his laptop, sometimes with a book, and Layla would play. Sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 4. At first, it was awkward. She was hyper-aware of his presence, worried about every mistake. But gradually, she forgot he was there. She lost herself in Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Debussy. She worked through her old repertoire, pieces she'd performed dozens of times, and they came back to her like old friends she'd abandoned. On the 3rd day, she stopped in the middle of a Chopin etude, frustrated. "My left hand is too weak. I can't maintain the power in the bass line." Rashid looked up from his laptop. "What can you do about it?" "Practice. That's all. Just keep working it until the strength comes back." She started again, focusing on the left hand alone, drilling the same passage over and over. "You're very patient with yourself," Rashid observed after a while. "Music teaches you patience. You can't rush mastery. You have to trust the process." She paused. "That's something I forgot these past 3 years. I forgot how to trust that things could get better. I just survived day to day." "I think I've never trusted the process," Rashid said quietly. "I've always just bought what I wanted. If something didn't work immediately, I'd throw money at it or abandon it. Watching you work like this, it's humbling." They began talking during her breaks. Small conversations at first, then deeper ones. She learned that Rashid's wealth had come from his grandfather, that he'd never really built anything himself, that he felt hollow sometimes despite all his possessions, that his marriage had ended badly because, in his words, he'd been too selfish to really see his wife as a partner. "I'm trying to be different," he admitted one afternoon, "but I don't really know how. I've been one way my whole life." "Change is hard," Layla said. "But you're here, aren't you? Sitting with me instead of wherever rich men go to show off their wealth. That's something," he laughed. "Barely something. But I suppose it's a start." On the 6th day, something shifted. Layla was working through the 2nd movement of Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, and the melody was pouring out with such emotion that she didn't notice when Rashid stood up and moved closer to the piano. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find him standing right there, tears on his face. "Why are you crying?" she asked. because that was the most honest thing I've ever heard. Music is truth, isn't it? You can't lie when you play like that. No, Layla agreed softly. You can't. I've spent my whole life lying, Rashid said. Not with words necessarily, but with actions. Pretending I'm more than I am. Hiding behind money and status. But you just sit at that piano and pour out your soul. You make yourself completely vulnerable. How do you do that? Because I have nothing left to lose, Layla said. When you've lost everything that matters, vulnerability stops being scary. It becomes freeing. They stood there in silence for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Not romance, it was too soon for that, too complicated, but understanding. Recognition. Two people from completely different worlds finding unexpected common ground. Friday is almost here, Rashid said. How do you feel? Terrified, Layla admitted, but also alive. For the first time in 3 years, I feel alive. Then you're ready. The morning of the audition arrived with bright sunshine and clear skies. Rashid had arranged everything, a car, appropriate clothes for her to wear, even sheet music in case she needed it. As they drove to the opera house, Layla's hands shook in her lap. What if they don't like what they hear? She whispered. Rashid reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. Then they're fools. But they won't be. Trust yourself, Layla. Trust what you can do. The Dubai Opera House rose before them, modern and magnificent. As they walked through the doors together, Layla felt like she was stepping back into her old life. Or maybe into a new one entirely. She couldn't tell which, and maybe it didn't matter. All that mattered was the piano waiting on the stage, and the music still living in her fingers. Refusing to die despite everything the world had thrown at her. She was ready to let it speak again. The audition room at the Dubai Opera House was smaller than Layla had imagined. Intimate almost. A single grand piano sat center stage under warm lights. In the darkness beyond, she could make out 3 figures sitting at a table. The panel. The people who would decide whether her comeback was possible or just a dream she'd held on to too long. Tariq was one of them. He gave her an encouraging nod as she walked onto the stage. Rashid sat in the back row, his presence a quiet anchor. He'd wanted to stay in the lobby, said he didn't want to add pressure, but she'd asked him to be there. Somehow having him present felt right. Ms. Haddad, one of the panelists said, a woman with sharp eyes and silver hair. We've heard interesting things about you. Please, whenever you're ready. Layla sat at the piano, adjusting the bench. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, she realized. From anticipation, from the sheer weight of this moment. 3 years of silence about to break wide open. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, second movement, the same piece she'd been playing when the bombs fell. For 3 years, she'd avoided it. Couldn't even think about it without panic rising in her chest. But last night, while practicing, she'd realized something. She needed to play it, needed to reclaim it. The bombs had taken her brother, her home, her country. She wouldn't let them take this music too. Her fingers touched the keys and the opening chords filled the space. Soft, melancholic, beautiful. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. Not just the bad ones. The good ones too. Her brother's face in the audience that last night. Proud and beaming. Her father's hands guiding her fingers when she was 6 years old. Her mother humming in the kitchen while Layla practiced. Damascus in spring. Jasmine blooming in the courtyard. The melody unfolded and she poured everything into it. Every loss. Every tear she'd cried while scrubbing floors. Every moment she'd felt invisible, forgotten, erased. But also every small kindness she'd received. Fatima's warm breakfast. The other maids who'd shared their stories. And Rashid, sitting in his living room afternoon after afternoon, choosing to see her as a person rather than a function. Her hands moved through the complex passages with growing confidence. The technical demands of Rachmaninoff were significant, but her fingers remembered. More than that, they understood. This wasn't just about playing the right notes in the right order. It was about telling a story. Her story. In the audience, Rashid found himself leaning forward, barely breathing. He'd heard her practice this piece a dozen times over the past week, but this was different. This was Layla unleashed, holding nothing back. He thought about the night he'd called her over to his piano to humiliate her. The cruelty of it made him sick now. How close he'd come to never discovering this, never knowing her, never being changed by her. The silver-haired panelist had stopped taking notes. She was simply listening, her expression unreadable but intent. Tariq had tears on his face again, unashamed. The third panelist, a younger man, sat with his mouth slightly open. Layla reached the climax of the piece, her whole body engaged with the music. The piano sang and wept and soared. She wasn't in Dubai anymore. She was everywhere music had ever mattered to her. Every practice room, every concert hall, every moment when sound became something more than sound, became meaning itself. The final notes faded into silence. Layla kept her hands on the keys, her eyes still closed, not ready to return to the world just yet. When she finally opened them and turned to face the panel, she found all three of them on their feet, applauding. "Extraordinary," the silver-haired woman said, shaking her head. "Truly extraordinary. Ms. Haddad, where have you been hiding?" "Surviving," Layla said simply. The audition had been scheduled for 15 minutes, but they kept her for an hour. They wanted to hear more. She played Chopin, Debussy, even some Bach. With each piece she felt stronger, more certain. This was who she was. Not a maid. Not a refugee. A pianist. That identity had been buried but never dead. Afterward, in the lobby, the silver-haired woman, whose name was Nadia, pulled Layla aside. "We want you to perform in our winter season. A full evening concert. We'll feature you as a rising talent, though clearly you're anything but rising. You've already risen. You just needed a stage to show it." Layla could barely process the words. "A full concert? That's deserved," Nadia finished. "That's what it is. We'll work out the details with Tariq. But Ms. Haddad, I need to know. Are you committed to this? A concert of this magnitude requires months of preparation, promotion, rehearsals. I need to know you're in this for the long term." Layla looked across the lobby to where Rashid stood waiting, patient and solid. Then she looked back at Nadia. "I'm committed. Music is who I am. I forgot that for a while, but I'm ready to remember." "Good. Then we'll be in touch." In the car ride home, Layla was quiet, overwhelmed. Rashid didn't push her to talk, just drove through the Dubai streets as the city sparkled around them. "Thank you," she said finally, "for all of it. The audition wouldn't have happened without you." "The talent was already there," Rashid replied. "I just opened a door. You walked through it yourself. Still, you didn't have to do any of this. You could have just let me keep cleaning your house, kept ignoring me like you'd done for 8 months. Why did you help me?" Rashid was quiet for a long moment. "Because you showed me something I needed to see, that I'd become a person I didn't like very much. Watching you work these past weeks, seeing your dedication, your courage to face your fears, it made me want to be better. You changed me, Layla. The least I could do was help you reclaim what you'd lost." Over the next 3 months, Layla prepared for her concert, but something else was growing too, an idea that had started small and become impossible to ignore. One evening, she found Rashid in his study going over financial documents. She knocked softly and he looked up, smiling. "How was practice?" he asked. "Good. But I need to talk to you about something." She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about my journey, about how I went from concert pianist to maid, and how one moment, one person's kindness changed everything. And I keep thinking about all the others." "Others?" "Refugees. People with talent, with skills, with dreams, who end up in jobs that waste what they could offer the world, not because they're not good enough, but because they lost everything and have no way to rebuild. How many brilliant musicians are scrubbing floors right now? How many artists are washing dishes? How many doctors are driving taxis?" Rashid leaned back, listening intently. "I want to start a music school," Layla said, her voice gaining strength. "A school for refugee children, free of charge, teaching them piano, violin, whatever instruments we can provide. Not just because music is beautiful, but because it gives hope. It gives identity. It says, you are more than your circumstances." "That's a beautiful vision," Rashid said. "I know it would cost money, a lot of money. I don't have any, obviously. Hey, but I thought maybe you might know people who would donate, or organizations that support this kind of thing, or—" "I'll fund it," Rashid interrupted. Layla blinked. "What?" "I'll fund it completely. Building, instruments, teachers' salaries, everything. We'll call it the Haddad Institute for Musical Arts." "Rashid, that would cost millions." "You can't just—" "Yes, I can." "Layla, I've spent my entire life using my money for nothing meaningful. Fancy cars. Expensive art I don't really appreciate. Showing off. What you're proposing actually matters. It changes lives. Let me do this. Let me be part of something real. Tears filled Layla's eyes. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll run it. Say you'll take everything you've learned, all your pain and triumph, and use it to help others. Yes, she whispered. Yes. 6 months later, the Haddad Institute opened its doors in a beautiful building near the old quarter of Dubai. 40 children attended the opening day ceremony. Kids from Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Afghanistan. Children who'd seen too much, lost too much, but who still had dreams. Layla stood at the podium about to give her speech when she noticed Rashid at the back of the room. He wasn't sitting with the donors and dignitaries. He was sitting with the children, helping a small girl hold her violin properly. His expensive suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, she smiled and began to speak. Music saved my life, not once but twice. The first time was when I was young and it gave me purpose. The second time was when I'd lost everything, and someone gave me a chance to remember who I was. Today we open these doors to say that every child here has value. Every dream matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. She performed that day, playing for an audience of children who watched with wide eyes. When she finished, a little boy approached her shyly. Miss Layla, do you think someone like me could play like that someday? She knelt down to his level. I think someone like you could play even better. I believe in you. That night, after everyone had gone home, Layla and Rashid stood in the empty school, looking at the rows of instruments, the practice rooms, the possibility contained in every corner. We did something good today, Rashid said quietly. We did something necessary, Layla corrected. But yes, good too, he turned to her. I've been thinking. What you said about me opening a door and you walking through it. I think you opened a door for me too. To being a better person, to seeing what matters. We open doors for each other, Layla said. That's what people do when they really see each other. Outside, Dubai glittered under the stars. Inside, a school full of instruments waited for children's hands. And somewhere between a mansion where a maid once scrubbed floors and a concert hall where a pianist had reclaimed her voice, two people had found redemption in the most unexpected place. In recognizing each other's humanity, they'd rediscovered their own.